Welcome to Furthering Christendom. I'm your host, Tyler McNabb, and I'm here with a special guest today, Perry Hendricks. How you doing?
I'm all right.
You're all right, just all right, just all
I'm
right.
always just all right. That's where I run. I don't run great. I don't run bad. Just all right.
Okay, okay. I'll take it. I'll take it. How are you doing? What are you up to lately, philosophy wise?
Uh, uh, oh man. What am I doing philosophy-wise? Well, not a whole lot. Most of my work, I'm watching my kids most of the day, and so most of my philosophy is like from 9 p.m. to midnight or something like that.
Nice.
But
Yeah.
when I'm doing it, I don't know. I'm working on I am supposed to be working on a book on diversity statements in universities.
Ah.
And I'm going to be the book is aiming to show that we ought not require these kinds of statements at
Mm,
public universities. I mean, think about it this way. Suppose that you were applying for a bricklayer job at like Bricklayer Incorporated.
mm,
They asked for you to submit like a cover letter, some references, your resume, and then they're like, "Oh yeah, why don't you spend, 2 pages telling us about how you feel about diversity, how you promoted it in the past, how you'll promote it in the
mm.
future." That'd be kind of weird, right? And I give this example to people all the time, and anyone outside of academia responds immediately like, "That's crazy. How are
Mm.
public universities requiring this?" So that's one issue that I'm writing
So,
on.
so what you say is between that, abortion, and philosophy of religion, you're really popular, right? Is that what you're saying?
That's what I gather. That's what I
Very
gather.
good. I also know you're supposed to be working on an abortion paper
Yeah,
eventually.
I got asked by these two scoundrels to write a chapter on abortion for some book. And so
Yes,
uh, I have a plan to write it, but I've not written it yet.
very good, very good.
What else am I doing? I think I've got something on immigration and that's under
Uh,
review, something on evil that's under review,
hmm.
and I'm forgetting something else, but I think there's a couple more in there. Oh, the Evil God Challenge. I think that, but otherwise, I don't have any like research plan. I just write things that are annoying to me at the time. I'll just write them out and go from there. So
Get your
that's why it's
frustration out.
it's not frustration. It's just if some issue like annoys me, it's like if I think of I have something to say about some issue, I'll just write it up. What else am I going to do? Not write it up? That'd be weird, you
Yeah,
know?
that's right. That's right. So today we're going to talk about skeptical theism. So you got a new book that's come out with Palgrave Macmillan. Do you have a copy like behind you? Or you hiding it?
I had some behind me, but I took them down because I didn't want to look like some tool just promoting my own stuff. But I do have a copy of it.
Promote
Yes.
away. Promote away.
I mean, this isn't going to promote. I mean, there's probably like 5 people who bought the book, but this is what it looks like. It's the
Nice.
cover is a picture of a praying mantis eating a cicada that my wife and I stumbled across on a walk one day.
Huh.
And Jim Elliott tells me the cover sucks, but I thought it was pretty cool. And the alternatives weren't very good. So since the alternatives sucked even more, and I thought this one was cool,
I
that's
wasn't
what
sure
I
if
went
there's
with.
like some deeper relation with that, like um, the praying mantis's cognitive faculties are limited and its perception or something like that. No.
Well, maybe it's an instance of suffering if cicadas
Oh, yes.
feel. So I thought that was a close enough connection. My other alternative was like a picture of a maze, but my wife told me that that wasn't a good idea, because
Yeah,
it's just
yeah. No, I like it. Yeah, yeah. All right, so can you just tell me kind of like, there's a lot of people argue back and forth about um, uh, kind of which problem of evil should we be concerned with, right? You have the logical problem of evil, the evidential, probabilistic problem of evil, and you have different variations and versions of each one. Tell me, like, what do you think is like kind of the most formidable problem? You don't have to like tell me premise by premise, but if you could just kind of rough gist of what you take to be a serious problem of evil.
so I think we should be concerned with all problems of evil in the sense that, they're all arguments against theism, and we're interested in whether theism is true. So we should be interested in all of them. But there are a lot of really implausible ones, like logical problems of evil. We people used to say that the logical problem of evil has been refuted by Plantinga. But lately that's probably not the case. It's more like Plantinga has a good and interesting, plausible reply to it. But it's probably better to say it's more accurate to say like, well, I mean, these logical arguments from evil just aren't very good. They rely on really implausible claims and really hard to justify claims. So those ones aren't terribly interesting. And then there are also arguments like William Rowe's no-seum arguments from evil, where we identify some evil and we say something like, we can't think of any reason that would justify God in allowing this evil. So probably there is no such reason. If God existed, there would have to be such a reason, and therefore probably God doesn't exist. I don't think those ones are terribly compelling. So I think,
Bambi, man, Bambi.
I mean, Bambi had it coming.
Bambi catches on fire.
Yeah. Like I said, Bambi had it coming. So we don't know what Bambi was like before that.
Right.
No,
it's a virtue theodicy for Bambi.
So I think that I think the two most promising arguments, at least the ones that I think are most plausible, are Michael Tooley's and Paul Draper's. And I think that I'm not going to talk about Tooley's. It's pretty complicated,
right.
But I think that one that is very much worth addressing. But Paul Draper's is also I think probably the most pressing one that we ought to address. So the way that argument goes is really roughly something like this: like, look at the facts about pain and pleasure in the world and how they're distributed among creatures on Earth, right? The thought is that, well, this distribution of pain and pleasure isn't terribly unlikely if a competing hypothesis to theism is true, like the hypothesis of indifference, which states that, humans and sentient life on Earth aren't the product of a maleficent or perfectly good being, right? It's not totally surprising that pain and pleasure will be distributed in the way they are and play the roles that they do. But then he says, well, think about if theism is true. The distribution of pain and pleasure is really unlikely. We wouldn't find animals suffering in these ways, and we would think that pain and pleasure would play more of a role in moral development or something like that. God would have reasons to ensure that pain and pleasure aren't distributed the way that we see this, right? And because of this, it looks like the probability of pain and pleasure distribution that we know of is more likely given the hypothesis of indifference than it is given theism. And so it's strong evidence against theism. That's what I think is the most powerful. His and Tooley's are the most serious arguments from evil currently on offer.
All right, but is it power level over 9,000? That's the real question here. What about skeptical?
I'm embarrassed that I understand the reference. That's like to that anime show with the hair, right?
Dragon Ball Z. Yes, that's right. That's right.
Yeah.
The goat of anime. Yeah. So, what about skeptical theism? Your book is about skeptical theism. Skeptical theism can offer a response of some sort. Can you walk me through that?
So there are a lot of different kinds of skeptical theism. I give arguments for two different kinds of skeptical theism in my book. One kind is an axiological skeptical theism. So it's a skeptical theism about value, the value of different kinds of states of affairs. That's probably the most popular skeptical theism on offer. I take that to be roughly approximate to what Michael Bergman is doing in his work on skeptical theism. But the kind of skeptical theism I think that really matters and is really the most important is what I call deontological skeptical theism. And I'm just going to call that skeptical theism from here on out because I'm lazy. So skeptical theism, the kind that I'm interested in, is a skepticism about the perceived weight of God's reasons. And why I think that's what we should focus on is because when we're trying to predict how God would act, we need to take into account the weight of God's reasons, because God's going to do whatever he has most reason to do, whatever his weightiest reasons are, right? And value is one, it could be a reason for God, but it's not the sole reason for God. There can be non-axiological reasons that God has. So to focus exclusively on axiology is a mistake, I think. And that's why I think that any argument from evil that exclusively focuses on axiology is just implausible from the start. It's certainly not going to be well, let me just put it this way. Any axiological argument from evil is going to fail because it's not taking into account possible non-axiological reasons that God would have. And so like the traditional way to state no-seem arguments, I think just doesn't work for that reason. And a lot of other arguments succumb to that as well. So, okay, why does skeptical theism matter here? Well, the way that I state skeptical theism, and I'm going to take out a couple, I'm going to state it in a simpler way than I do in the book because the way I do it there is technical and annoying, and I'm going to try to be less technical and annoying than I normally am. So skeptical theism, as I'm going to understand it, states something like this, like we have no good public antecedent reason to think it's likely that the perceived weight of God's reasons for the permission of some evil resembles the actual weight of his reasons for permitting that evil. What do I mean by a public reason? Well, I just mean a reason that is sort of equally accessible in principle. Like, you know, the fact that a sample is large is a public reason because you and I both can in principle, have access to it in the same way. Essentially, public reasons are reasons that aren't my own mental states or your own mental states, because you and I have privileged access to them. I can know about my own mental states in a way that you can't. I know about them by having them. So things like my own beliefs, my own intuitions or seemings are not public reasons. Those are going to be private reasons.
Yeah, so like evidence or reasons from a third person perspective, right? That's what we have in mind here from kind of an objective standpoint. Okay.
Yes. And then by antecedent reasons, I just mean reasons that sort of set aside our beliefs about whether or not God exists. And that's because it kind of makes things harder on theists because, you know, we can't just say, we can't do this Morean shift, which I think is fine, but I don't think there's anything wrong with a Morean shift done properly, but I'm setting them aside in this sort of statement of skepticism. And so, okay, so that explains what I mean by public and antecedent reasons. So I say, so there's one more issue. So I'm talking about the perceived weight of God's reasons versus the actual weight of God's reasons. So the perceived weight of God's reasons we would think are like what we recognize God's reasons to be and their recognized weight. So we might I can recognize that you have a reason to feed your kids and that it's a pretty weighty reason to feed your kids. Yeah. You know, it takes some serious justifying reason to not feed them to outweigh your requiring reason to feed your kids. But we can distinguish between the perceived weight of someone's reasons and the actual weight, because we can always be wrong about what the actual weight of someone's reasons is. I might be saying, I might think that you have a really, really strong requiring reason to feed your kids, but maybe it's a little less strong than I think. And so we need to distinguish between the perceived weight and the actual weight. And so in that case, so that should be pretty clear. So let me restate skeptical theism then and see if you have any other questions on that. So skeptical theism, as I'm understanding it, at least for my purposes, is this. We have no good reason, no good public antecedent reason to think that the perceived weight of God's reasons for permitting some evil likely resembles the actual weight of his reasons for permitting that evil. Is that clear?
Yeah, enough? Absolutely.
Okay.
And here's what up. Go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, and I was going to say, and everyone should agree with that. It's and here's why. It's true by default, because the way that I am understanding, and I guess I forgot to explain this part, but the way that I'm understanding we have no good reason for X is I'm saying we don't currently recognize a reason for X. And here's what I mean by that. So when I'm driving a car, I see that there's a blinking light in front of me. I have a good reason to think that that car is going to be turning left because its left turn signal's on. Right. My daughters don't have a good reason. They see the blinking, but it means nothing to them. They don't recognize it as a good reason. And with skeptical theism, we're concerned with the reasons we recognize. Right. And so understood this way, the claim is we have no good public antecedent reason to think that the perceived weight of God's reasons resembles the actual weight of his reasons is going to be true by default until and unless we are given a good reason to think otherwise. Does that make sense?
Yep, absolutely. And that would include the how one looks at the relationship between pain and pleasure in what we would expect. It would kind of undercut what we would expect and that sort of thing, right?
The thought is this. So take the distribution of pain and pleasure that we have, that we observe in the world. Yep. The only way that we can sort of say that it's less likely given theism than it is given the hypothesis of indifference is to say how likely it is given theism. But if it's really true that we have no good public antecedent reason to think that the perceived weight of God's reasons resembles the actual weight, then how are we making any probability claim here? It doesn't seem like it's possible, because we have to, if we are to make a probability claim here justifiably, we need to think that the perceived weight of God's reasons resemble the actual weight. Like, imagine you stepped on a scale and it spit out a number, like let's say 200 pounds. No offense, but
I'm 163.
So it spits out 200 pounds. But imagine it were really true that you and I looked at this and we saw that it said 200, and we really had no good reason to think that the number was actually indicative of what your actual weight is. If that's true, then we can't use that number to make any predictions about your actual weight or whatever. And so that's why it's important when we're thinking we have to have a good reason, or let me put it more carefully. So if we come to see that we have no good reason to think that the perceived weight of God's reasons, right? So that's kind of the perceived weight of God's reasons is that number being spit out on the scale. If we have no good reason to think that resembles the actual weight, then that's going to prevent us from making these probability assignments. And so it's going to prevent this argument from evil from getting off the ground.
Exactly. And it even gets worse, like if you were to, say, endorse a more classical view of God, where God's not a person and not even a moral agent, and I mean, it's just the kind of justification needed for thinking what God would do, or in this case, our perceived reasons matching up to actual reasons. The gulf would just be so massive, right?
Yeah. I'm not sure I signed up for that account yet, but I know that you're.
That's right. That's right. I do. Right. So, but haven't you heard, Perry? If you do this with the problem of evil, Perry, then Pandora's box is wide open, and now we can't know anything about anything.
That's what a lot of people say, but there's a difference between saying something and showing something. And it's never been shown that skeptical theism entails this radical kind of skepticism, right? So yeah, lots of people will say it entails skepticism about the external world, or moral skepticism.
Or destroys natural theology.
Yeah, that one's a bit trickier, actually. No one has really developed it as much as I'd like, but there is some sort of intuitive pull to how it's harder to do natural theology. So I try to address that in a chapter of the book and try to show how you can have a skeptical theist friendly model of natural theology and also natural atheology. So I develop a model for skeptical theists to sort of make predictions about how God would act, and also for atheists who atheists to make these kinds of arguments that evade the grasp of skeptical theism. It's just a lot harder to do. So, right, Pandora's box. So the problem with a lot of these objections to skeptical theism is that they make these epistemological claims, like that it entails this kind of radical skepticism, but they never incorporate the relevant epistemology. They don't really compare and see how skeptical theism fares on mainstream epistemological views. Now, one paper that we were talking about, I try to go through and give a few different, go through a few mainstream views of epistemology and see how these objections fare, and I argue that they don't fare very well. So what I do is I say something like this, like, look at this popular externalist theory of knowledge, or warrant or justification. It looks like a skeptical theist's beliefs can satisfy all of these conditions and so be justified, be warranted, be knowledge, even if, you endorse skeptical theism. And then I do that with something that's a little more internalisty, although it's debatable whether phenomenal conservatism is internalist. But I show that, if you endorse phenomenal conservatism, that can provide you certain kinds of justification for holding beliefs about the world and about morality and all sorts of other things, even if you endorse skeptical theism. You might even think that on the direct, the name's grasping me, where you sort of have this, not direct insight, but I can't remember. Feldman's the guy who is this,
yeah.
Yeah, the name's blanking on me, but how you can have this direct acquaintance. Yeah. You might think on that internalist view that you can sort of have endorse skeptical theism and be directly acquainted with moral facts or something like that. And
Uh-huh.
so when you lay out these different epistemological views, it's just not clear that the skepticism follows. And well, let me say one other thing. I think that the moral, it's even clear that on the way that I've um, defined skeptical theism here, that moral objections just don't work at all. And here's why. The skeptical theism as I've stated it, is about God's reasons. And God's reasons aren't going to be the same as human reasons, partly just in virtue of us occupying a different relation. So God is going to occupy, if God exists, God is the creator of the world. That puts him in a different relation to the world than we have, since we're part of it, which means he has different reasons. And so his set of reasons is going to be different than our set of reasons. But skeptical theism is a skepticism about human reason, about or not human reason. It's a skepticism about God's reasons. I got that off. So to be skeptical about God's reasons doesn't tell us that we should be skeptical about our reasons or even our moral reasons for actions. So moral objections to skeptical theism just can't get off the ground when we state it deontologically, like I have here. Does that make
Yeah,
sense?
so yeah, absolutely. And going back to the kind of epistemic approach, I guess what you're saying is, hey, it might be such that I just find myself believing in God, or that God's good, or that God created this. Um, but at the same time, I just don't find myself believing that I'm capable to understand God's mind, or to uh, know that my perceived reasons are his actual reasons, that sort of thing, or on phenomenal conservatism. It just seems to me that it's more likely that God would do this, but when it comes to evil, maybe I just don't have that seeming. And so you can kind of use these epistemic theories to explain how skeptical theism could still be true, while at the same time still having room for knowledge about God, or even some resources from natural theology. Is that correct?
Yes, that's one way. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. So the thought is like you need to do more work to show that this
That's
radical
right.
skepticism follows, because we can see that that on these popular theories of knowledge, you can there are clear ways in which you can be a skeptical theist and have this kind of knowledge or justification. So more work needs to be done that hasn't been done
Exactly.
yet.
And even when it comes to natural theology, though, right? Like typically the worry is in reference to some sort of probabilistic Bayesian type approach to natural theology, not syllogisms and classical demonstrations. At least as far as I've seen. Is that right?
Yeah, there might be one or two outliers, but that's basically it. It's
Yeah.
about the yeah.
Okay.
And
Well,
yeah.
go ahead.
Oh, sorry, go on.
No, no, no. Go ahead.
I thought you were going to develop that more, but then I thought, are you going to develop that more?
No, no. I was just curious to get your feedback on that briefly.
Yeah, so I think so. One thing to note is that in
For those who
principle,
aren't and fans of kind of Bayes, or just look at Bayes as like a heuristic that's helpful, the urgency about natural theology is not as is not as prevalent, especially if you're inclined to more classical demonstrations. That was kind of my thought. Go ahead. Sorry.
yeah, so I mean, one thing to note is that skeptical theism isn't even going to, in principle, it's not going to be a threat to things like modal cosmological arguments, or the modal ontological argument, or um, or the Kalam cosmological or Kalam, I
Right.
can't speak, Kalam cosmological argument. So with respect to those kinds of arguments, skeptical theism isn't going to even come into play. It's not to say that those arguments are successful, but
Right.
that it's not going to be an issue for those. And it's
Exactly.
also worth pointing out that this is also going to have the same effect on certain atheistic arguments. So in principle, skeptical theism isn't going to touch like Paul Draper's low priors argument, because it's not
Uh-huh.
that about it doesn't involve predicting how God would act, or it's not going to touch arguments that claim there's some kind of contradiction among God's
Mhm.
attributes or something like that. So it's not going to touch those kinds of arguments. It's
Right.
more after these probabilistic arguments that depend on predicting how God would act. And yeah, the way that I suggest, very briefly, doing this, avoiding skeptical theism and doing natural theology, or doing theodicy even, is to sort of think about, well, what kind of worlds we think that if God exists, he's going to be this perfect or maximally great being or something like that. The simplest kind of God is going to be the best or kind of being that could exist. And so we might think about, what sort of aspects resemble God in important ways? Because if aspects that resemble him in important ways, you might think are just going to be ones that he would likely create, because the best worlds will resemble him in important ways. So maybe you think that conscious agency resembles God in a really important way. And if that's the case, you might say, okay, well, if it's not crazy low, it's not crazy unlikely that God would create a world with conscious agents then. And then you might run a sort of argument from consciousness for theism based on that. Now, so since it's more of a conceptual move and one not based on perceived weight of God's reasons, you might be able to run an argument for theism that way. Alternatively, you might try to run an argument for atheism in a similar way. But I talk about it in one of these chapters, and I just think it's a lot harder to do that.
Right.
And I lay out a few reasons why you might think that. But that's at least one way for atheists and theists to sort of proceed after skeptical theism has swept away these other concerns.
Yeah, very good, very good. It looks great. And for those who are unfamiliar with the literature, I guess my last question for you is, what makes your book unique? Obviously, it is unique. I won't spoil why it's unique, but go ahead and just kind of explain to the viewer um, uh, why what sort of unique contribution your book makes.
It is, without a doubt, the absolute, undeniable worst book on skeptical theism ever written, because it's, the only one ever written on it. And that is very unique.
Also, by that token, the greatest book, full manuscript length book
That's
of skeptical theism as well.
that's true, but that's less exciting. What else makes it unique? Well, I give arguments for for axiological skeptical theism, which is the most popular kind of skeptical theism on offer. As I said, I think that approximates to Michael Bergman's skeptical theism. And I do the same for the kind of skeptical theism I just talked about. So oftentimes when on the literature of skeptical theism, we're just sort of given analogies and to sort of motivate holding the view. But I try to, go a little farther and show that this is the default position, and then show that all these different objections fail. Another thing I do, I guess, is I address common sense problems of evil pretty thoroughly in the final chapter. And then I also take a detour. I mean, I imagine lots of people will find this chapter boring, but I try to relate some of the contemporary literature on faith to skeptical theism. I say something like this, like, suppose that it's true that we can't justify our beliefs about divine testimony can't amount to knowledge or can't be justified by like Eric Weilenberg's or Hud Hudson's objections to skeptical theism. I think Hud Hudson's objection, for the record, is the most pressing one to skeptical theism. Well, it's tied with Swinburne and Draper's equiprobability objection. But anyway, so I use this chapter and say, well, okay, suppose that's true. What does the contemporary literature on faith have to sort of tell us about what follows from the skepticism? And I say, well, it looks like you can have rational faith in divine testimony, even if you don't have justified beliefs, or even if they don't amount to knowledge, and that mainstream views of faith have this result. And I don't know. On the one hand, I'm tempted to say that's kind of interesting, but on the other hand, I'm tempted to say that's pretty boring. But so maybe somebody will find that interesting. And I guess I also talk about anti-theodicy a little bit, which is one of the most. I shouldn't say anything about anti-theodicy. I have nothing nice to say. Let me stop myself there.
Well, on that note, Perry, it's great having you. Thanks for coming on. Thanks for talking about your book, and hopefully talk to you soon.
Yep. Thanks for having me.